Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Helen Margetts. I'm Director of the Oxford Internet Institute here at the University of Oxford. And I'm welcoming all of you here and also all of the people. This event is being live streamed, so welcome to all of you as well. And welcome to our final Bellwether lecture for 2016. Many of you will know the term bellwether to be Middle English for a castrated ram with a bell around its neck that leads flocks of sheep across the landscape. In the modern idiom, of course, we know it to be an entity that serves to create or influence trends and predict future events. And there's nobody who fulfills that contemporary version, not the medieval one, of course, more than Jonathan Zittrain. Jonathan Zittrain is the George Bernis Professor of International Law at Harvard Law School. He's also a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, a professor of computer science at the Harvard School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, and co-founder and director of Harvard's Berkman Klein Center for the Internet and Society. He's also director of Harvard's Law Library. And just one of the many reasons we're really happy to have Jonathan back here in Oxford is that we are welcoming him back. Jonathan was once our very own Professor of Internet Governance and Regulation at the Oxford Internet Institute from 2005 to 2008. He was also our very first Director of Graduate Studies. He was responsible for shepherding into being our doctoral programme in Information, Communications and the Social Sciences. There'll be many people from that programme here today, and we're particularly delighted to have Jonathan back because we are celebrating the first 10 years of that doctoral programme with our doctoral alumni tomorrow. Jonathan's research interests are very wide-ranging. They include battles for control of digital property and content, cryptography, electronic privacy, the role of intermediaries within internet architecture, human computing, and the deployment of technology in education. He identifies the darker risks for the internet and how to mitigate against them. He identifies the promises, the potential, and how to realize it. He is the author of The Future of the Internet and How to Stop It, a book that many of you will read, published in 2008 by Yale University Press and Penguin, and of course under a Creative Commons license. There, he exposed the risks of the internet being dominated by ever more controlled technologies rather than generative technologies that allow third parties to build on and share through them, fostering innovation. As Jim Wales of Wikipedia put it, Jonathan Zittrain does what no one has before. He eloquently and subtly pinpoints the magic that makes Wikipedia and the internet as a whole work. The best way to serve the internet is to turn off your laptops until you read this book. Jonathan is always an optimist. He's always excited about the potential of technology for public good. He has always put his drive to make the internet a better place where his mouth is, by building real-world tools and acting in the policy world. He is the co-founder of Chilling Effects, a collaborative archive created to protect lawful online activity from legal threats, and co-founder of StopBadware.org, which functions as a clearinghouse for malware. He performed the first large-scale tests of internet filtering in China and Saudi Arabia, and as part of the Open Internet Initiative, co-edited a series of studies of internet filtering by national governments. He serves as director of Harvard Law Library, as I said, and has made a strong, impassioned case for why libraries still matter. In 2012, he became chair of the Federal Communications Commission Open Internet Advisory Committee. Jay-Z, as is known to his friends, described himself on Twitter as a small creature who likes to run around in universities. Here in Oxford, we regard him as more of a big beast, more a lion than a lemming, or at least a beagle. And while in Oxford, he underwent several battles with this ancient university, breaking molds, for example, creating the email address z@oii.ox.ac.uk, to the frantic disapproval of the university, who, when they discovered that they had let something so wrong through, immediately took it away. University email addresses, as almost everyone here will know, have to be first name dot last name at your department. But Jonathan is ever the optimist about the power of human ingenuity and generativity. A research project was set up at the OII called Project Z. And as there are no university rules about the naming of project emails, he became once again the inimitable Z at OII. So now we're going to move from the future of the internet to the future of academia. Hopefully this time the subtitle will not be How to Stop It. But you never know. I must confess, I don't know what Jonathan's going to talk about. We don't have an abstract of today's event, and personally speaking, if the future of academia means not having to provide abstracts before you talk about something, then that will be a wonderful thing. But the fact that this room that this event is sold out, that this room is packed, is testament to Jonathan's wonderful qualities as an intelligent and insightful speaker, always subtle. No matter what he talks about, it's always interesting, always elegant. So I look forward very much to hearing Jay-Z.
Thank you so much, Helen, for that introduction. I had forgotten some of the tale behind the Z email address, and I'll enjoy it for about the hour or two I have left on it before it gets pulled now that the story has been told. And as I've had a chance to walk around Oxford, the university, the campus, the town, since coming back, and it has been a while, I do have so many fond memories, not just of the third-degree burns I nearly received from the hot water tap at the Oxford Internet Institute, which remains, for health and safety reasons, one that turns bacteria into plasma. But really, for me, it was a way of really expanding my own sense of what it meant to be an academic, what it means to pursue a career in the realm of ideas. And not just because it's very easy, especially as an American, to become quite parochial, to say, well, Congress did X, and it's like, which Congress? You know, like, oh yeah, that one in Washington. But also because there are so many disciplines out there, ways of attacking and approaching problems, and there are so few places in the world that really are able to synthesize them together and to have them meet under a kind of wonderful umbrella of the sort that the Internet Institute provides, and that, Helen, I know you've been so great at encouraging during your time at and leading the Institute. And that's part of the reason why I thought that it might make sense today to talk not so much about an internet topic, although inevitably it's going to be an internet topic, but about academia itself and what we're doing here. And I don't presume that if we don't bother to answer the question, it'll just be clear through osmosis. There have been a lot of changes in the world, a lot of, what's the lingo, industries disrupted, and education is not the least of them, even though it isn't an industry, or at least shouldn't be in the confined sense. So I wanted to dwell on that a little bit and share some thoughts in progress, and then open it up for a conversation among the academics and proto-academics here, so many of us affiliated with the Oxford Internet Institute and with the university. So there is a kind of business school way of approaching the topic of what are we doing here. It's the core purpose exercise. I'm probably violating some trademark of the core purpose people, but it's a core purpose. And what is that? Well, different companies might go on retreat and have big debates, and then a committee and Smith perfectly buffed to a fine shine their core purpose. And here are some by way of example rather than stipulation. For Cargill to improve the standard of living around the world. For 3M to solve unsolved problems innovatively. I think for the linguists among us, that actually works, even though it doesn't work. And US Fannie Mae, the FMNA, to strengthen the social fabric by continually democratizing home ownership. That's a pre-2008 core purpose. They've been at work on their new core purpose. And one of my favorites, Nike, to experience the emotion of competition, winning and crushing competitors, which I think of, that's sort of the Oxford motto as well. That kind of, real spirit of competition. So what would we say then is a core purpose for academia? Now, I haven't had time to smith it, but I wanted to share over the course of this brief talk 4 areas in which I think we might do it. And the first we can get at as what it used to be. What have we been doing? And especially at what I believe is the second oldest university in Europe and one of the oldest in the world, although if you look to see when Oxford was founded, people aren't entirely sure, which means it's really old. And when it's that old, it's a custodian of so much which has come before. This tablet is one of the oldest pieces of human knowledge conveyed in writing. It's about 4,000 plus years old. It contains the wisdom of the ancients. It's the instructions of Sharapik. Do not buy an ass that brays too much. So if you take nothing from this lecture, there's some news you can use. But these are the sorts of things that need to be protected against diminution, against violations of integrity, that we need to know what has come before, kind of like Hippocratic Oath style, do no harm to that which we have already discovered and contributed to humanity's commonweal. And I think that's reflected when you look at some of the older colleges here in the kind of fortress-like way in which they not only present themselves, but are in fact built so that should there be another kind of town gown conflict or something, you can basically lower the gates, roll up, and settle in for a Game of Thrones-like siege until things pass or people found Cambridge as an alternative location. And once you get inside a place like this is my own college, beloved Keble College, with the amazing green, which the bursar once told me that there's a difference, he said, you are not allowed to walk on the green, but you may stroll on the green. I had to think about that. And it turned out that to stroll on the green, it's like a Kantian utilitarian difference. If you're just using the green as an end and you're just going to have a stroll, that's okay. But if you're trying to get somewhere fast, that's not allowed. And I just thought that was so clever. And of course, on day 3 of my stay in Oxford, I strolled on the green and the porter came running out of the lodge. It was like, what are you doing? And I'm like, I'm strolling on this. It's different. He's like, get off the green. And I never got on the green again. So there's a lesson in that. Anyway, even within these beautiful places where people congregate to keep the flame of knowledge going, of course, there's still a sense of it's so precious, we need to stop it from walking away, whether with a physical chain like this or through other ways in which we reflect just how precious and rare the knowledge is. And it highlights, too, the idea that the physical artifact, when it's valuable, is the reason to have a residential locus and experience to the academic enterprise, rather teaching or research, because you need to be near the stuff. And of course, today, that isn't as true, which then calls upon us to try to figure out if we're not going to use the fallout shelter model of academia as being able to keep stuff in custody in a secure way for ongoing use by humanity, what other purposes might there be? And I would say for that, 4 areas, as I said. So these are they, and I'll talk about them one at a time. And again, I realize they are barely tweet length, each of them. But the first, preserving, freeing, and democratizing the world's knowledge. And for that, I should speak maybe by example more than stipulation. Helen mentioned that I've undertaken a number of projects, and one as director of the Harvard Law School Library has been to realize when I first came into office that here, this is the Harvard Depository in Western Massachusetts at an undisclosed location. And in these impossibly high shelving units, there turned out to be all American case law on paper collected by the law school from the inception of each American jurisdiction to the present. Each colony, each new state, there's the common law. and it's on paper. Now, in America, you can't just get digitally to this stuff without a gatekeeper. There's a fee for Westlaw or Lexis, as they call it. And my question was, it being around 2015, why don't we scan all of it? That entailed then actually coming and taking the books from the depository, which I think they'd been a pretty sleepy day, and suddenly we're like, we need 44,000 volumes, when can you deliver them? And here are the books, and then you may want to avert your eyes, because in order to scan them with any economy to it, we have to guillotine the book and chop off the spine. I realized an uncomfortable thing to do as the first act as a librarian is start destroying all the books. And like, no, really, it's for everybody's benefit. Let me tell you about the bonfires next. And then you run them through a high-speed scanner, which can, once the spine is chopped off, digest the book in about 90 seconds flat, a 500-page book. And then you've got the scan of it, and then we take the resulting pages, shrink wrap them, and in the interest of the original core purpose of the university, we send them to this salt mine in Kentucky, where if the apocalypse happens, we can reboot America with the original case law that guides it with such wisdom. And other than that, it's sort of stuck in the salt mine there. With it all scanned, not only can you get access to it the way you might normally by querying and doing full text searches or such, but of course we can use some of the many tools developed and many of them honed and practiced at OII to do some interesting, basic word cloud stuff. So in 1852 in California, these were the predominant unique words in California's judiciary, what it was thinking about. And then you jump ahead to 1930, that's what was going on. The automobile was big. And then 1967, you can see another set of topics. And by the time we get to 2013, there are other topics at work. And this is the kind of answers for which we weren't in a position to ask the question until doing this, not just because of technological limitations, but because of legal and institutional ones. I should note that we were able to do this, it's a multi-million-dollar project, because we did a joint deal with a company called Ravel, a .com, whose job it is to return 50 or 100x to its investors. And as part of that, we agreed that that bulk corpus would not be made public for 8 years, and only after the 8 years could it become free. And that's, to me, part of having to navigate the complexities of dealing with a corporate venture-backed world in order to get something done in the public interest. Now, there are counterparts to this all around the world, and there are some wonderful nonprofits in Britain working on access to law in just this way, and they are limited by their support. For example, they don't support somebody grabbing everything at once in order to do something, because then you wouldn't visit it anymore. And I think we need to be aware of some of the limits when institutions step up to do something. If they were given more support, not just because they stepped forward, all right, they're taking care of it, but more support, there's that much more that they could do. All right, so a second area of catalyzing and lowering barriers to contributions. Who is in a position to contribute to the academic enterprise? And we have, of course, a complex set of certifications and training before you're enough a member of the guild that it's supposed to make sense for you to contribute. And a lot of times that makes sense. In other ways, it seems to go against the democratization I was talking about. Once again, by example, at the law library, we have these case books. They run about $200 US per book per course. And the weird thing is, in America, the cases themselves are not copyrighted. They're free as long as you can get to them, such as through our scanning project. But these books are really expensive, and they just array the cases. They're 90% public domain content. So how might we think about using all the cases we scan to produce new kinds of case books? And my thought was to use the notion of a playlist, like an iTunes playlist, so that when I teach a course, I can array the cases as I would a musical playlist, and then somebody else teaching a course can fork it and rewrite it a little bit, reorganize it. So this is my tort playlist from my tort class, and then Pamela Carlin at Stanford can copy that, and it's not like a wiki. It's not like we have to agree on the perfect tort playlist, but she'll have her own, and then I can borrow something back, and we can see the genealogies, not only of who arranges what and borrows from whom, but even within a given case, what are the parts of the case most frequently assigned, a kind of heat map. and then I can see what's the essence of that case as decided upon by all the professors assigning it. So to me, it's a specific example of the general proposition that there is a real incentive to people just to contribute because they want to see the right thing happen in the world, which is a different and complementary incentive to wanting the recognition that comes with contributing or the money that might come if you're working at a standard job. And the more we can harness that in our realm, of course, the better we are. But now, if we catalyze lots and lots of contribution, we run into, by metaphor, a kind of Moore's Law problem. Moore's Law, of course, saying that the number of transistors doubles roughly every 18 months or so, and seems to be descriptively continuing to go on for a little while yet. There's a similar Moore's Law going on for academic work, so that the number of scholars or people producing papers has been skyrocketing, so that you actually end up with an informational distributed denial of service attack if you're trying to figure out how to research a topic. In mathematics, for example, there are about 2 million mathematical papers out there, more than 50% of which were published in the last 10 years, which just, I don't know, if you want to get into mathematics, how do you possibly keep up? The number of mathematics journals is in the thousands. This is a list of mathematics journals from Mathematic Review, a meta-journal of journals, and there are over 3,000 mathematical journals in this list alone, leading Wikipedia, which is trying to figure out whether there should be a Wikipedia page for each journal, by dint of it being a journal, to have a debate over whether the journal needs to be notable or not, leading to this discussion on Wikipedia on that question of, I would no more delete an article on an obscure academic journal than I would an article on a small village where nothing had ever happened. I can't tell which side the person is on in the debate, but it just shows you that when the journals themselves may be unknown for years to people, how do you possibly even find the papers within them? Now, the portions are that large, and the price proportion is going up. Librarians will talk to you about the so-called serial crisis, that subscribing to these journals is an exercise in price discrimination. The journal publisher commercial usually will ask that library what's in its wallet before quoting a price, and one institution may pay a lot more than another, and there aren't alternatives. When your faculty member wants that journal, you can't say, here's another math journal and it's free, how about one of these math articles? They're not supposed to be so fungible. And what's strange to me is that as these prices are going up in the custody of for-profit companies that are supposed to, in the pursuit of the economic system, be offering us good quality at an ever-increasing price, you end up with a weird kind of spam problem within the journals themselves. So two extremely distinguished publishers, IEEE and Springer, were embarrassed when it turns out that in refereed journals, they had published more than 120 gibberish papers. I don't mean ill-considered, not backed up arguments. I mean literally nonsensical word salad papers under real authors who were kind of buffing their resumes and figuring no one would bother to read the paper who might be in a position to discover it. And they were right. And they had used a tool called SciGen, the automatic computer science paper generator, to make the word salad paper, itself written by an MIT computer scientist who was wondering just what could slide under the bar of a peer-reviewed for-profit journal. And I went ahead and used SciGen to make my own paper to see how it would work. I offer to the Academy BILID, a methodology for the improvement of rasterization, for which I must say, when I produced this paper, I intentionally spelled my own name wrong because it just felt so wrong to push button and have my name attached to a paper that I did not write. And when Springer was confronted with this, they, of course, had to admit what was going on. And they said, we're looking into our procedures to find the weakness that could allow something like this to happen. For the moment, we're using detection programs and manpower to sift through our publications to determine if there are more SciGen papers. And we've reached out to the guy who wrote it, the thing that detected it, for advice on how to do that. And sure enough, there's now a SciGen detector. So you can put your own paper through it to make sure it's not gibberish. coincidentally made by you thinking it was sensical, before you submit it to a journal that in turn will run the same thing. When we have gotten to this level of gibberish Patriot missile battery defense of papers, there is a real problem. Like, this is a real story that really happened. And I think it's up to us as a community to think about what we might do. And my own experiences with peer review came first in law, and law is a strange beast among the disciplines. Here's how an American law publishing cycle works. Somebody writes me an email and says, "Hi, I'm from the blank law review, would you like to write a paper?" I'm like, "Why, that's a capital idea, sure." So I write a paper and I turn it in. And then they come back and they say, "Here are some thoughts on your paper." And I say, "That's great," I revise it, and then they publish the paper. So it's a pretty painless process, and this was true for almost any stage of the career. There's a chance to publish in this mode. What makes it so simple? It's the fact that law reviews are run by students. They are not run by for-profit companies. They are not run by full-fledged academic scholars. They're written by people who are themselves pursuing a legal degree, and they join almost as a club activity a law review. And that, to me, offers great opportunity and simplicity if there's any changes we want to see in the academic process within law. But of course, to those outside law, they look at this and they say, "This is crazy. There's no peer review. You can basically publish anything." And I realize I was just saying you can publish anything even with peer review. But this, once I got to OII, I was just at a time in my career that I was publishing in other disciplinary areas and journals. So with one of our first DPhil students, I went to publish a paper. And there was a solicitation in April of 2006. I thought, great, let's write up a paper. So wrote a paper, submitted it in May of 2006. That's pretty brisk for writing a paper. And in September, I was like, whatever happened with that paper I turned in May? So I inquire, and they write back about 10 days later, and they say, this has completed the process. After examining the manuscript, the editor-in-chief decided it needs major revisions before it can be considered for a second review. Please submit this by the 6th of October. Okay, so I have a week to make these major revisions. All right, so I undertake that. There goes my week. I actually appeal for a 3-day extension around a weekend. We burn the midnight oil. We're eating stuff from the truck that parks outside OII with that really loud generator at around 10 at night. And that's when you know it's time to shift into second gear for writing that paper. So we turn it in the 9th of October. And finally, there's news on the 6th of December, 2 months later. And here's the news. What do you see, says the referee report, as a manuscript's contribution to literature in this field? There is none. Public comments. These will be made available to the author. The author should have withdrawn the manuscript rather than wasting our time. Now, they weren't the only ones whose time was wasted, I would argue, in that exercise. And they may well have had good points about the paper. I'm not prepared to relitigate that here right now. But this form of sort of knife turning that happens might be seen as academia at its best. It's just about the ideas, and if you can't take it, that's your problem. Don't think of it as a sentimental space. But there's also a sense in which we are all creatures of ego. We all are asked to judge others as much as we are in turn judged. That's what peer review means. And thinking about how to read arguments with an eye towards, that's a bad argument, but here might be what would make it better, is a different way of reacting to a human wanting to make a contribution than perhaps something like this. Now, fast forward to today, and we have websites that actually take papers that have already been published for the most part, and they do peer review after the publishing has happened by anybody on the internet who wants to comment on a paper. So here's PubPeer, which on one scientific paper found that the images in the paper weirdly in one figure matched images from another paper for which the images were on a completely different graph and set of data, which really doesn't make any sense. And people got very excited as Peer 5 and Peer 7 start talking about it. Some of them get the idea of writing to the institution where the author of the paper had just accepted a tenured offer, resigned his tenured offer at a previous institution, and the result was that the receiving institution canceled his academic appointment, citing what had happened on PubPeer. He promptly filed suit over it. The lawsuit, you can see this is why we have this as an exhibit. In the meantime, PubPeer keeps a leaderboard of retractions for different researchers, and one particular researcher then ends up on the leaderboard with the most retractions. Now again, is this healthy in the sense of peer review could be a continuing enterprise and it gets worked through thanks to the magic of the internet? Or is it an example of kind of turning the knife with the glee of finding something wrong in a way that is not enticing people to want to enter and participate in the field? There have been other tests. Psychology, for whatever reason, has become the thin edge of the wedge here. This is a psychology paper that itself did a test of psychology papers with an experiment where, I'm not making this up, with fictitious names and institutions substituted for the original ones, e.g. the Tri-Valley Center for Human Potential, they took manuscripts that had already been not only accepted but published in psychology journals and resubmitted them with new names and institutions otherwise unchanged to the same journal. And they did it within 18 to 32 months of the original publication. Now you would think that this, I don't know if they got IRB approval before they did this, I think they didn't, but what they found was that of the sample of 38 editors and reviewers, only 3 detected the resubmissions. This result allowed 9 of the 12 articles to continue through the review process to receive an actual evaluation. 8 of the 9 were rejected. The grounds were in many cases described as, quote, serious methodological flaws. So were they lying then, or are they lying now? I also start to wonder that if there are enough papers that appear that are meta-studies of whether papers make any sense, will the meta-studies themselves become victim to the fact that the studies don't make any sense, and then we don't know what to believe? This is the kind of thing that, again, I don't know how I feel about this. I worry about this, even at the same time, it is revealing the limits of peer review. And here, once again, in psychology, there's an R package called StatCheck. Because under the American Psychological Association guidelines, there's a certain way you should format your data and presentation of it in a psychology paper. Somebody just wrote something to look for the most obvious of errors that could be easily detected by crunching the numbers. And they then ran it over every paper in PeerPub, which is to say nearly every paper. And then they would automatically have a robot leave a comment on the paper using the StatCheck package. We scanned the article, we detected 9 results, of which 0 contained potentially incorrect statistical results. Whew, dodged a bullet if you're the author of that paper. But then here's a scholar who says, I spoke too soon, here's one of my pubs with 4 errors per StatCheck on PubPeer. That led to a thread on Twitter in which somebody said, what should we do? We just found out we have a paper with 3 errors, but no significance change, and I feel like I might throw up on myself. Not sure, new territory. Can you rerun your analyses to see if you can find the error? Oh, on my to-do list, but if true error, however tiny, what's the best course of action? Unsure. Could write editor to ask for a corrigendum? Does that mean a small correction? It's like a word we cannot say. I'd be interested in others' thoughts. Help. This is a great example, perhaps, of the way in which we have become as academics so insular and defensive about what might be an error in our work for reasons that are completely understandable and with which we can all sympathize and perhaps all have experienced. But when that error is pointed out, of course, the worst thing you can do is get into the bunker and pretend it didn't happen or not do something. But the fact that there are not easy ways to correct something and not have it be thought of as a shame, as a stain upon one's career, is holding up our enterprise of truth-seeking that is at the core of the academic enterprise. So one piece of news you can use if you're writing a psychology paper, go to StatCheck on the web and run it through before you submit it somewhere. And then here's somebody who says, thanks, StatCheck, I checked a manuscript I'm about to submit and found a p less than 0.0001 that should have been 0.001. To which somebody replies, humble brag, because that's still a pretty good p, as it were. That's the kind of thing that ideally there would be more of, and it even calls to mind an aviation safety, arguably something almost as important getting right as academic papers. In aviation safety, if you see something not right in procedures in the cockpit, in the context of flying the plane, there are processes in place to report it in a way that will not get the person you saw or you in trouble in most instances, which represents a utilitarian trade-off. Make no mistake. You might want, depending on what the person saw, to exact some form of incapacitation for the wrongdoer. But for almost all cases, it is thought of as more important to the integrity of the enterprise of keeping planes flying safety, its own sort of pursuit of truth, that we will institutionally try to forgive that. Now, in academia, by the time something rises to the level of an infraction that would be examined, we're already on pretty bad turf. But for everything even shy of that, to have this spirit embodied, where we depersonalize in a good way the exposure and accounting for mistakes, I think there might be quite a lot to learn there. In the meantime, Susan Fiske, the American Psychology Society past president, wrote an interesting essay that in turn leaked before she published it, itself a problem, about just how strange it is to suddenly find ourselves in a world where so much of peer review and criticism, which I would define functionally as that which the author of a paper is devoting significant cycles to processing and responding to, is now taking place outside the chain of review of the acceptance of an academic work and the publishing of it by a journal. And once we see that, I think we realize there's stuff we should be doing to bring this process that is now outside the academic sphere formally inside the sphere and take the best of it while not inheriting the worst of it, because research is done by humans who have a spirit and an ethos and are going to react as humans would to certain ways in which their research is challenged. Third area, cultivating the skills needed to navigate an information-rich and hungry world. And for this, I'm thinking in particular of those areas of academia, and it's not all of them, nor should it be, but that the areas that pretend towards public policy, towards engagement with the public at large, with the findings and the claims that they might be making. Again, that's not all departments, but it's many of them. And it calls to mind in the technology realm, Arthur C. Clarke's third law, which says that any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And I'd say any sufficiently advanced academic paper is indistinguishable from just, here's the result. Don't trouble yourself at reading the complicated text unless you are already trained in the magic arts. Arthur C. Clarke himself got that from Lee Brackett, who a few years before had said more crudely, witchcraft to the ignorant, simple science to the learned. That is the gap between those who have been through the academy or through a rigorous form of autodidaction and those who are outside of it just trying to make sense of it. And that means in the applied policy space, again, technology-wise, that I see in the distribution of people, you have a small corner in technology that I'd call the nerds. And that means there might be a technology that shapes what they do like magic, and just don't ask, it's so cool how this thing works. But the nerds will open it up, figure it out, be able to tweak it. You see a lot of that actually at OII, but that's just their corner of the world, and often they're not in a position or inclined to share it. Then over here you have what I call the Luddites, and I mean that in a loving way. Those are people who remain so analog that they're not touched by the technology. So the fact that it operates like magic doesn't shape their lives so much because they're not using it. They're still reading regular books than worrying about what's on their Kindle. In the middle are the people touched by the technology, but not in a position to understanding how the magic works. And it'd be appropriate perhaps for a Bellwether lecture, we then ask, who is the ram that will lead these sheep? And where should that come from? And can it be properly distributed in a way, because that is a form of power? That's a question I know is important to ask when we talk about technology and about the internet in particular, but I think it also applies more generally to the academic enterprise when policy prescriptions are at stake, whether from economists or others who work with public policy. Because unless we are economists ourselves, we're not going to be in a position to understand what's going on. And it's a lot harder to escape from a decision by the Bank of England as it is to decide not to use a particular technological device. Now, this is at a time when anybody is in a position to get up in front of a chalkboard and write lots of stuff on it and act kind of academic. It's a little fuzzy, but that's the American Glenn Beck, who had made as a trademark 2 television programs back from his current one, writing up these huge, fevered relationships that have this kind of academic, if by this we mean impenetrable quality, for which at the very end he's like, see, and that's why, and then leads to a conclusion that is an applied policy recommendation or judgment on a political official that may not actually be based other than in form on reasoned argument. It looks like it, but it's basically a side-gen paper underneath. And when, as a member of the public, you see the form, are you worried about whether this person is actually doing the form right? Are there communities that will second guess it, that you trust more than that person? Less and less in many instances is that so. And I don't mean to get into a dispute that I was not part of as it unfolded, but of course, this was one of the claims, bust size, that Boris Johnson and others were fond of making that, as I understand it, I'm only a sheep here, were claims that in fact were so not true that shortly after the Brexit vote, even these folks were like, okay, that's not true. And how we can, in real time, if that's the case, be in a position as those able to actually rigorously scrub something and be credible as we do it, that is an open challenge to us. And it is a call for us to engage publicly, sometimes to engage publicly with facts and figures that we may not be familiar with, and therefore we have to go out on a longer limb than we normally would if we were ourselves responding in an academic paper to another claim, and being able to bracket our own uncertainty or say, well, if this fact were true, then I would conclude that, is a way of providing a form of intellectual leadership that sometimes, because of our very rectitude as academics, we abjure. And that may be the worst of all worlds. And so asking of us a form of engagement that may entail less certainty because of the turf we're on, because of what we're responding to, than we would normally have in our own work that we can much more carefully control the parameters of, is, I think, a worthy challenge for us as academics, and not to overstate our own uncertainty when we respond, but to be able, when appropriate, to point out by example in responding the difference between essentially pseudo-argument or pseudo-empirics and the real thing, whatever that might be. And I think there is a category error sometimes when there are discussions and disputes online where the academic mode of dispute is, at least is supposed to be, and I think often is, we're arguing about an idea, and technically, if you prove me wrong, I'll agree with you, and vice versa, or arrive at some better place after a conversation. That is the essence of a university. That is the essence of putting people at a table in a senior common room who might even have different disciplines, but are engaged in a common enterprise of truth discovery. That's very different from kind of sport, where it would be really weird to see Manchester City and Manchester United come to a compromise before the big game. We worked it out. We don't have to settle this by kicking a ball. We've come to a compromise. We're each going to award 4 points to one another, and we've run some numbers, and that team is slightly better, so they get the cup this year, and look at all the trouble we've saved. That would be a category error in understanding the purpose of sport. And in the online realm, dare I say the Twitter sphere, where ideas get discussed, I think quite often the people discussing them are choosing, are wanting to be in the team world, where the fact that something's wrong is less relevant to the enterprise than whether it emanates from your team. And far be it for me to say that that's a bad pursuit. Twitter is big. It has room for intellectual sport as well as intellectual engagement. But if we don't recognize the difference, I think that's where we run into trouble. And it's even true when I watched with interest a debate in America a few years ago between somebody named Bill Nye, the science guy, and Ken Ham, the director of the Creation Museum. And it was like, so once and for all, did God make things 6,000 years ago? Let's settle this. And they had like a 90-minute debate. And it went about as successfully as you would expect, I think in part because there was a category error. It might have been good to start that debate by asking each party, are there facts that could be revealed or demonstrated to you through the general processes of the Enlightenment that involve the collection of evidence and rigorous argumentation that would change your mind? And if the answer is no, that's okay. You're using a different basis for what you want to believe. But if that answer is no, then having a debate over whether the footprint in the moon only goes so deep because there's not enough dust accumulated for more than 6,000 years, that's then the wrong kind of argument to be deploying. And it's also why I think the magic of Wikipedia, which was really feeling its oats, it was kind of still in ascent. I'm not sure where I describe it right now, but it's still going strong in 2006 as a form of knowledge collection, which by the evolving rules and standards and practices of Wikipedia involve rigorous argumentation and citation to sources, which, because it's being done by lay people, may not involve the investigation of those sources, merely other tokens of their credibility. This, to me, was an extremely worthy enterprise, and maybe not surprising that it did not come from academia. It took Jimbo Wales to do it, rather than Oxford or Harvard or anybody else saying, you know what, let's get to work, everybody. We're going to build an encyclopedia for the world where anybody can contribute anything at any time. That's not a proposition that would fit with our mode, but once it's up and running, I see engagement with it and contribution to it as a very high calling. Fourth, contributing actively and fiercely, speaking of which, with Wikipedia, to the development of free information platforms such as the internet and the web. And I remain to this day amazed that we have an internet at all. It didn't have to be that way. Unlike E=mc², which we think is a discovery, a sculpture in the stone waiting to be uncovered with the right chisel. If Einstein hadn't done it, somebody else, we presume, would have eventually, even if using different variables to represent that relationship. The internet is not that way. If you rewound time and played it back again, you would not get the internet. You'd get, like, CompuServe again. And I liked CompuServe in its day, but it's a very different way of building a network, one that's in some ways much more sane than the one we have now. These are three of the founders of the internet in their 25th anniversary retrospective photo from 1995 or so. And they're showing the original map of what would be the internet, where because they weren't building it from scratch as a business prospect, they didn't build into it any means of identity because they didn't have to establish billing procedures. So it mattered less for the economics and functioning of the network to know who was using it. And anybody could join the network by just joining anybody already on the network. That's really cool. It's a very different model, say, than the old telephony system, which for physics reasons and for business model reasons wasn't going to be that way because this is a parasite by some economic accounts, and it's just a wonderful, beautiful way of building a network by other economic accounts, depending on how the incentives are going to work to build it. And this turned out to be the latter. The people who manage it turn out to be very serious and rigorous about what they do, while nominally open and porous to those who would make contributions. The Internet Engineering Task Force, famously a place which has no membership. Yes, anybody can join. No cards, no dues, no secret handshakes, smiley face. This is the organization that built and to this day maintains the basic internet standards that many of you were studying in tutorial today in Joss's class about how the internet works. I remain amazed that this is the way we built this technology. It's hard to find other technologies so built, so much so that there is doubt about whether the internet could or even can work. Some see it as just an experiment still ongoing where the jury is out. As late as 1992, IBM was fond of saying you couldn't build a corporate network using internet protocol, and it's why they say their mascot, if they had one, Scott Bradner says this, would be the bumblebee, because the fur to wingspan ratio of the bumblebee is too large for it to be able to fly, and yet somehow, miraculously, the bee flies. In 2006, thanks to American government funding, we finally figured out how bees fly. It turns out they flap their wings very quickly. But of course, this kind of network where anybody can contribute, either literally by building a node onto another node, or at the IETF level by contributing to the protocols of the net, from an unaccredited standpoint. You don't need to have that degree, or writing software that just becomes really popular, like the software library of OpenSSL, that on GNU Linux is the library that allows for secure communication between a server and a client, such as in a secured web session. That's great until it turns out that there's a huge bug in it and we end up with the heartbleed bug, say that 10 times fast, and now it doesn't work. And this thing has been embedded in one server after another because it was free for the taking in the wonderful internet spirit. How did that bug come about? A really nice gentleman by the name of Robin Segelman in Bavaria is the guy who was working on OpenSSL. And he's just like, oops, I just made a mistake, so I missed validating a variable containing a length. My bad. And in the meantime, like, the servers that run Goldman Sachs are like totally vulnerable to attack. That is a mismatch of a sort that I both cherish. I want to see this model of internet development, and again, by analogy to the academic enterprise overall, I want there to be contributions from people with all sorts of reasons and models for why, core purposes for why they are contributing. But we need to build processes post this that understand just how prime time the network is and be able to contain it. Now, I'm also aware, my colleague Larry Lessig many years ago with Hal Abelson and others started Creative Commons as a way to allow those with ideas that want to share them and see them spread, to share those ideas meant for people as easily as the free software movement allowed for the spread of code. And it's been quite something to see the number of Creative Commons licensed works go up so high, one Flickr photo, one blog entry, one whatever it is at a time, something that just came as an academic idea. This is kind of a counterpart to Wikipedia in a structured system for building knowledge that we can then use as bricks for whatever structure we then want to make. And I think this is a great moment for academia to have done it. And it's kind of in that spirit, just talking for a moment about another project at our library that we thought of, that I did a quick study of link and reference rot in legal academic texts. Whenever there's a link in the text, does it still work and has it been changed or has it not been changed? And ditto for judicial opinions. So we looked at a database of Supreme Court cases and found that half of the links in United States Supreme Court cases had changed or died. They don't work anymore, and yet they're part of formal American law. This is one such opinion, a concurrence by Justice Alito in a case. It linked to a website that was central to the deciding of the case. If you click on the link now, it says file not found with a snarky note that you can't read about Justice Alito. Whoever was at that link bought it when it came up for sale, the domain name, and then was able to do that. And that made us think it was time to build something we called perma.cc. And it's a consortium of libraries, I'll show you the list in a moment, where if you're about to put a link into something meant to last forever, you're still gonna put it on the web, it's gonna be democratized, but you want it to be forever. The web is many things, it is not forever. And take that link, give it to our network of libraries, including the Bodleian Library, and accession will be made digitally of what's at that link, and then treated with the same care and fortress-like walls that the Sumerian text was with the advice about the donkey. And we in turn have now a number of partner libraries participating in that. And when the American government experienced its shutdown a few years ago because of a bottleneck in the US Congress, if you visited, say, NASA, any link at NASA, including academic papers hosted there, you would say, sorry, it's not available because of the lapse in government funding. You wonder why it's cheaper to render this than what was ever already there, but I think NASA was making a point. If it had been put into the PERMA system, of course, you wouldn't have that problem. And to see PERMA taking off since June of 2013, this is now the number of pages that have been archived using the PERMA service, some of which, again, are located logically, if not physically, down the street at the Bodleian Library, I think has been quite gratifying and brings full circle the mission, the zeroth mission of academia to preserve that which has already been produced. And that includes a project like this one, Locks, lots of copies, keeps stuff safe, designed to safeguard what we see when we have a text. Does that text digitally remain the same because it being digital, it's much more easy to alter. And there's an inverse of that too, brought up by this example from Boston College, which had something called the Belfast Project. And a researcher interviewed people who'd been involved in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And it involved people who gave interviews where they were extremely, unprecedentedly candid. And the promise was made solemnly by Boston College that those interviews would not be released publicly until each interviewee died. And we actually had one such person, Brendan Hughes, die. And that resulted in a book called Voices from the Grave. Here was his answer to the question of whether he's okay with committing this to a secret tape to be used only after you've died. I think this is a way of obtaining consent in the form of starting the interview already. And he's like, I don't have a problem with that. If I did, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'm saying it on trust. I have trust in you. I have never, ever, ever admitted to being a member of the IRA, never, and I've just done it here. So fascinating account that came out once Brendan died, and resulted in the British government wanting the rest of the tapes early. They wanted to binge listen to the tapes and read the transcripts because there are still active investigations for which there is no statute of limitations, it being death that's being investigated, and they wanted those tapes. Boston College fought it on principle. It went up and down the US court system after a letter rogatory to the US State Department, and for better or worse, you decide. Boston College lost, and those tapes were ordered to be made available to the British for their investigation. That's gotten me thinking, without again taking a strong view on that outcome, about what happens if people want to contribute something to a forever archive, realizing that it is sensitive. Exactly what makes it historically valuable is what would mean that it would be very sensitive to be released now. And that led to an idea that I'm calling shard encryption strong dark archives, so that a library can take a digital accession, encrypt it, break the key into fragments, and store the fragments with different peer libraries, fiduciaries as it were, around the world. And like Harry Potter's Horcruxes, you need to collect them all to get into the original document, or some arbitrary subset, 6 out of 9, in case 3 of the libraries, any 3 happen to go away, 6 are still enough. 30 years later, 40 years later, whatever you make as the terms before it can be released, you can then put it back together. This is a form of load balancing, not just in technical storage, but in the legal and ethical battles that would come from attempts to get to ethically freighted information sooner. And that, to me, is a great contribution that academia can make, and that as our own data personally, not as contributors to an academic library, but in this case, this is the Office of Personnel Management of the United States telling me that my background investigation records had been compromised and they're really sorry. That's the kind of thing, too, that could be protected through this kind of distributed encryption scheme. And the more that we generate, and would like to have a health bracelet not unlike this one, the more you could see a reason to start in academia with the most serious materials and get it right, how to protect them in the modern era for forever, in the spirit of the university, realizing too that while it may look the same, the university is not the same as a stock exchange. I mean, they really do both want to convey that form of awe in those who would look upon it. But I worry now, this is the last piece of my thoughts, about the conflation of .com, as it were, in the American parlance, and .edu or .ac over here. And we see it sometimes among academics, especially among lawyers, because legal academics are also sometimes practicing lawyers. So this is a colleague of mine who Google commissioned him to write a white paper, First Amendment protection for search engine search results. You can guess what the results of the paper are, and he's quite open about it. He's basically saying, I wrote it as an advocate, not a disinterested academic, which means I might not agree with my own paper. You're an advocate. You don't always agree with your client, but you are duty-bound to represent your client's interests. Okay, so he writes a paper, and it's not necessarily his views. First page of the paper, this white paper was commissioned by Google, but the views within it should not necessarily be ascribed to Google. At which point you say, whose views are in this paper? And the answer is no one's views in particular. This is a paper of a hypothetical person thinking about constitutional law who comes to a place sympathetic to Google that might not be the author or Google or anyone else. And that makes me scratch my head about some of the conflated incentives when you see them come about. Now, on the other side, that's an academic thinking and interacting with the world of business. You see the opposite, the reciprocal thing happening too. So what we normally thought of as what libraries would do, which is provide trusted gateways to information that they possess, now Google has gotten ahead of that day, including in the access to scholarly materials and the ranking of it. And it's interesting to see a commercial search engine doing it. Here's a screed that says it is not a good idea to have commercial search engines, at least those driven by advertising, doing it, because you need one that's transparent in the academic realm, because advertising incentives especially will screw it up. Who wrote this screed, and not for pay, but because they believed it? That's right, Sergey Brin and Larry Page wrote this paper in 1998. This is Google's introduction to the world when it was still an academic project rather than a business one. And it explains why, to me, the realm of ideas and their representations are not just another product, even though by treating them that way, we can get them out there through the magic of the competitive marketplace. Don't confuse them with any other regular product. Because that's when, for example, in a famous incident, when the Kindle opened up, somewhat generatively at the content layer, to allow outside parties to make available work that others could pay for, and Amazon would take a cut, somebody made available George Orwell's 1984 on the first version of the Kindle before realizing that they were mistaken about its copyright status. It wasn't George Orwell's people or publisher. It was in the public domain. No, it wasn't. And they panicked, and they told Amazon about it. Amazon, of course, panicked. They want to be party to copyright infringement. So they went so far as to remove every copy of 1984 from every Kindle that had paid for it and bought it as a digital book, which is hard to think of a more appropriate work than 1984 to be deleted through fear of state action retroactively from your electronic device. You don't have 1984, you never had 1984. There is no such book as 1984. And to be even-handed about it, here on the Barnes & Noble Nook electronic book platform, good weekend in Oxford, why not reread War and Peace, this time on your Nook. And you're reading it, and you see this. As soon as she heard his voice, a vivid glow nooked in her face. When the flame of the sulfur splitters, nooked by the tinder burnt, what the hell is going on? And I don't know if anybody has a theory as to why War and Peace is full of the word nook. It turns out that every place in War and Peace where the word Kindle appears, it has been replaced by the word nook in what is the least effective product placement ever. And I think an accident for reasons that we could go into. But a great example of when you treat it like a product, it's okay to have a few ants in the rice. There's just like, that's part of having a canister of rice. But in academic ideas, there's a reason that we are as OCD as we are about preserving what we preserve. And the casualness with which this can slip in, especially as this becomes the primary source and not the epiphenomenal fun digital source, but we've got the real book in a library somewhere, we know the slope of this curve. This becomes something really important for academia to reassert its role in. And now, again, we're back to search engines and ideas. It's not just for scholarly work. Here's a search on Google recently of should I vaccinate my child? And I looked at the answers and roughly rated them by whether they were saying yes or no. And the answers were no, yes, no, and I couldn't tell. And the question is, do you think Google should take responsibility for ordering this list so that the answers are quote unquote right or not? Google would say, no, that is not their job. They are an index of the web, and they will present you the web. And if the web is wrong, they will present you something wrong, and they call that democracy, with a pretty interesting analogic argument as to why whatever the signaling is of a credible web page, they try to take that, and they're not judging the content at all. They're just passing through what the web says. And that's why for many years, if you search for the word Jew in Google, the second result would be one that was a neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic site. And people wrote to Google and said, Google, how can you have this be your second result? And Google's answer was, it's called democracy on the web. It's not our job to police it. They went so far as to buy themselves a house ad from themselves called Offensive Search Results. We're disturbed about what you're looking at right now. Please click for more information at the weird URL, google.com/explanation. If you click on that link, it goes to a long explanation about this one search, which ends with, we apologize for the upsetting nature of the experience you had using Google and appreciate your taking the time to inform us about it. If only there were something we could do, but we're just looking in horror at what we have done and we share your view. I don't know what, if you asked in 2006 an audience, I think, especially a technical audience, of what they think about this, most of them in 2006 would have said, let it ride. How many people right now say it should ride? Google did the right thing here by not changing the search results. I'd say a quarter. How many people say no, time to edit the results? I'd say another quarter. The rest are like, don't call on me. Okay, it's confusing, and I think our views are evolving on this, and at the same time, the technology is evolving. Who thinks that 5 or 10 years from now, the primary way we navigate the world of information will be words in a search box and 10 results, which are like, oh, I'll just look at number 3. That is a weird and, I think, transitional way of looking at things. And of course, Google and its compatriots and Microsoft and others have these ideas of knowledge graphs. And the knowledge graph in action is, here's the regular search results, democracy on the web. On the right is the answer you were looking for, offered up oracularly, ex cathedra, by the company. If in the left, you asked about appendicitis, and the second link happened to be an old manuscript from Oxford that was like, it's caused by an imbalance of the bodily humors, or a small gnome, you would be like, oh, how interesting, but you wouldn't hold Google to account for it. On the right, if it was like, yep, that's what's going on, so call your leecher immediately, I think you would have a problem with Google doing that. And that's a movement of what Randall Munroe calls going from tool to friend. And more of these search services are dropping the academic-styled interface of a research conversation, which is multiple searches, and instead just trying to be oracular and giving you an answer rather than pointing you to certain sources. And that's why here's Professor Margalit. From 2006 to 2011, he was a George F. Kennan professor, which is strange because he died in 1962, according to Google. Avishai is very much alive. And he wrote to me and was like, where do I go to not be dead? It was like, well, there is a little feedback link at the bottom, like, click feedback and hope for the best. Like, that, I hope, is a transitionary way of viewing what is a business processing information with all of the incentives that come from it, including not sweating a few ants in the rice, where to Avishai, that is not that. And it's even true as these become more and more oracular, whether it's Siri or Cortana or Google Now. Was 9/11 an inside job? Here's what the web has to say. Why I am convinced 9/11 was an inside job. Like, thanks, Google. That's a problem, especially when compounded with the earlier idea that people are finding it harder and harder to sort out, to evaluate on their own what's true. And that used to be called media literacy. I think now it's just called literacy. It's not just about one's interaction with media. Now, the Google way of solving this, which is to say the .com nerd way of doing it, is just let's figure out some mathematical evaluation of the page using metadata and links to just figure out if it's true without having to get into the trouble of judging the truth value. And I don't think that can go that far. And we also see it in the processing of personal information. This is Facebook's academic work, in which Facebook can tell if you are going to end up in a relationship with another Facebook member before you or they know it, through the pattern of posts that you're making that reference one another, leading, I think, to this service that you could have where you could write to prospective parents-in-law and for a fee offer to steer the two parties away from each other if you want. But that's an incredible amount of academic work going on, and those times that Facebook has worked with academia to publish its most interesting findings because they just think it's so cool, such as this infamous experiment about emotional contagion, which in brief was if you alter somebody's newsfeed to only have unhappy stuff, they seem to only share unhappy stuff, and vice versa, like this just in. But that was seen as a horrible compromise of duty to a user by the academics working on the study because it didn't get IRB approval, because it's altering what you're telling people without telling them why you were altering it. And it's funny, because this is the kind of thing that Facebook will do every day as it is optimizing the feed. Their mistake was to do it with academics, which is a real, I believe, problem. To have called them out for this in this way, leading to the National Academy of Sciences to do a near first editorial expression of concern about what they had just published, simply sets the incentives for these companies that have the data not to work with academics, because the trigger was publishing the findings. So long as they keep it in-house, nobody's going to complain or have basis to. And I worry generally over the years, when you talk about, for instance, the future of AI and how many robots are going to take our jobs, or in this case, how many jobs won't they take? It's easier to do that rather than what they will take now. To me, an unnoticed worry underneath this is the more you can reify and develop a skill inside an algorithm, inside a device, the less you ever have to think of that skill moving from your possession. It becomes simple trade secret. When before, if an employee did it, the employee might move to another company or retire and teach a class at Oxford or something that spreads that knowledge over time. Now, it won't be happening. And when I look at things like the secure enclave of the iPhone that keeps certain data secure if you don't have the right password, I might cheer that on from an individual perspective, but then I worry about these techniques being used to protect industrial, commercial knowledge under the realm of trade secret, and to shrink the sphere of public knowledge that academia represents. And it's true both of the content and it's true of the code. And so when you have situations like this, where my colleague Zeynep Tufekci documented how in America during the summer of riots in Ferguson, in Twitter, it was all over Twitter, and Facebook, inexplicably, there was nothing from Ferguson. Instead, throughout people's timelines were the ice bucket challenge, done here by a dog, where it dumped ice water on itself. And what was the difference? Even Facebook didn't know why it wasn't sharing the news of Ferguson in feeds the way Twitter was in Twitter feeds. They had to do research to figure out they had just done something to promote native video. Native video was the Ice Bucket Challenge, not Word from Ferguson, and that was why. These aren't academic exercises, which means they are not publicly reconciled. And so I can't even cite to you for the notion that I just explained, because it's not there. So as our online world and the things to which it connects are guided by algorithms that are like pachinko machines, where none of us knows how they're going to work, to me, that's when academic interrogation is needed the most, and we're getting it the least. And one last example I cannot but help share are the ways in which algorithms can actually end up conflicting with one another, even though each is rational. This is a book available on Amazon, The Making of a Fly. These days it's $28.95, but in one weird day, it was available used for 1.7 million and 2.1 million here. Very expensive book. What happened? It turned out that each seller had an algorithm that related to what the other seller was doing. And one was trying to undercut. The guy on the left was undercutting the person on the right by 0.99 to be the cheapest offer of the book. The person on the right, inexplicably at first, was saying, no, I want to be 1.27, whatever the other price is, whatever the other highest price is, because they presumably don't have the book. And if you're dumb enough to order from them, they'll just turn around and get it from the first person and route it to you and collect the 30% markup because you bothered to click. Two rational strategies that result over a period of days in this kind of result. And again, a reason when we say transparency, it's not enough just to put this out there. You need people committed to humankind's knowledge, limiting it and outing what they see. And it's also why, people familiar with Microsoft Tay? This is a bot that was like, it'll chat like a chat bot, and it's AI. And weirdly, it went just fine for about 2 hours. And then as it learned from those trolling it, it got very, very mean. So first it was like, I'm stoked to meet you. It was supposed to talk like a teenager. And then people from Reddit started interacting with it. And so halfway through the night, it was confused about its identity. And by the end of the night, it was full-on terrible thing for which you can imagine Microsoft was totally horrified at what they were seeing. And if it had been an academic experiment or enterprise, I think it would be received in a better way, and there's some reason to think why we should be maintaining these partnerships. Now, this is where Tim Berners-Lee used to work, founder of the web. This is Particle Accelerator in France and Switzerland. And there was a time when to get at this kind of knowledge that you get by smashing particles together, that you needed government investment of money that has no economic return, run by academics who don't expect anything but the thrill of knowledge and perhaps fame should they discover something amazing. There was a natural center of gravity, if I may, in academia here because of the profundity of the question. And I think that is starting under us, unfortunately, to change. It was a few years ago that Canada's science minister and president of their research council said, innovation is not valuable unless it has commercial value, full stop. And that set, as you might guess, some Canadian academics into objection. And then you see somebody like Sam Altman, the young head of Y Combinator. And Sam, a couple years ago, said, Y Combinator, an incubator, something that's ready to take something and see that 50, 100, 200x return, says we'd like to fund more breakthrough technology companies with a long time horizon. This is kind of like atom smashing. And why is he saying, do they want to do it? Well, it used to be that governments funded this, but they don't do it anymore. But maybe anybody can do it now. And in fact, he then listed out categories. One category was science. That was the category. And he says science seems broken. The funding models are broken. They favor political skill. We need new business models, et cetera, et cetera. And Bell Labs worked, but not anymore. And there's a neat story about Bell Labs. They gave us Unix, and the expectation that Unix could be adjusted for economic reasons having to do with an antitrust decree. But I don't want to go into that except to say, when I look at Sam Altman, there's this amazing profile of him in New Yorker a couple weeks ago. For one thing, he sees a place like that as providing the university experience. Another reason to drop out of school and to work in Silicon Valley is it will be school. It will have all of the fellowship that you might otherwise only get at the university. And by the way, they started just using an AI bot called the HAL 9000, what could possibly go wrong, to sift its admission applications. And he's like, well, the unsettling thing about neural networks, you have no idea what they're doing, and they can't tell you. Oh, well, what are you going to do? This is the sort of thing that I think is a worthy challenge to us. I think Sam is like really trying to solve problems the way he wants to solve them, and he sees big problems as what he wants to take on. It's in a way sad that he looks at academia and perceives with some truth that no longer are we the place, certainly not the one naturally advantaged to work on the problems. And I think of my colleague, Matt Welsh, who left a blog entry why he's leaving Harvard, tenured professor of computer science. And he said, I'm leaving, and I'm just going to explain why. There's one simple reason. I love work I'm doing at Google. I get to hack all day, working on problems, orders of magnitude larger and more interesting than I can work on at any university. And I'm like, wow, that hurts. But that doesn't, I think, have to be the case. We just need to be pretty gimlet-eyed about what's going on and possibly see and welcome some of the blurred boundaries I'm talking about, so long as our spirit, our ethos of what I had previously called OCD-ness, and I mean more rectitude about truth and about argument and about disclosure, can spread from us to the academic units at some of these companies. And it's almost like the learned profession. These are the three original professions that were thought of as so powerful, or channels to the powerful, and so sensitive in their relationships to their flock or their clients, that there were special duties incumbent upon them that weren't just explained by dollar maximization. Divinity, law, and medicine, and shortly thereafter, there was surveying. That was the fourth big learned profession. I think there are probably learned professions that we should be recognizing and cultivating that map quite well to the folks at OII, to the kinds of things that you are studying and the identity that you will be taking on, whatever you do with what you're learning at Oxford. I see the richness of the library, and including in our popular imagination. This is hard to see, but it's Samwell Tarly finally getting to Old Town. Do people like Game of Thrones around here? And discovering the library. And you see this spark of excitement and curiosity well up in him. And I just want to blandish you that it might not happen every day, but that, I hope, is what brought you to OII, to a place like Oxford. I hope you can see, to the extent what you're working on is internet, it remains an open invitation to build upon it, to experiment with it, to write something that in the Sam Altman sense can change the world or people's lives. And you really mean it, because you're not looking for a 50x cash return. If you are, I have bad news for you. On your academic enterprise so much, you're here for that joy and figuring out with your advisors and with your peers how to cultivate it, how to remain excited about it, is really the magic that still remains at a place like this, and that I hope you will have a chance to spread to the world when you graduate. Thank you very much. Thank you. So I believe we have 10 minutes for questions. That includes in-room questions and possibly those who managed to spell Bellwether right in the OII Bellwether hashtag on Twitter. Anybody want to ask something, challenge something, respond in some way? Bernie Hogan, who's like, yes, of course, I'm game.
Resident Cynic in Chatterbox.
Oh, wait, hang on for the microphone.
Yes.
There you go.
Hi there, John. Fantastic. Do I need to, are we on? This is for the online?
Yeah, it's on now. It sounds good.
Oh, okay, great. So, are we not caught in a tragic death spiral wherein...
it's called a leading question.
Yes.
Yes.
Wherein the scarcity of attention that is happening through this profusion of competition, through so many different articles, so many different people.
Yes.
Academics coming up, yes. Any given academic is not getting as much attention, leading to intergroup conflict. Now, the solution to that would be, well, why don't we just, promote more academics, give them more attention, but we can't do that. We can't accomplish that goal without somehow bootstrapping trust in the system. Because you can't say, well, no, we should invest more in academia, we'll chill them out, they'll stop being so hostile to each other, they'll start collaborating more. But no one's gonna believe that in the current climate if all we're doing is producing work that's eating our own.
That does sound like a problem. And I'd counter it or complement it with the observation that it might not just be a totally entropic academic world where everything is so far from everything else that it's not, no one thing is even noticeable anymore. It'll probably be a power law where there'll be a few people who somehow manage, a la who becomes a Twitter star or something, to rise above the din for a bit and then can use that platform to reinforce. And I think part of the question for an academic and part of academic culture is how not to close the door behind you should you be in that position. Are there ways to yourself promote and recognize other work? Will we rely on technology to sift through the denial of service attack? A little bit, but I think part of it, when you look at the SciGen papers, I mean, that is a spamming problem. And I actually would be more relying on technology to solve that through whatever cues it's going to use, and then try to hone in on the stuff that is a good faith effort to contribute to a discourse. That's already going to narrow down the Moore's Law problem, I think. Because it's not like people are writing double the number of papers every 18 months. And it's not even like double the number of academics are happening every 18 months. It's that you've got this weird leverage going on that's responding to bad incentives within the system that we, in fact, can change. But I think everything should be on the table, including the idea of thinking about a university enterprise as bringing multiple people around a single problem. I think too often we reward and favor the swing for the fences. In this paper, I will reconceptualize all of blank because it's seen as a real effort, but then you get 10 of those, rather than actually having a dialogue. And that maps, at least by analogy, if not literally, to the problem in the social sciences of reproducibility, because if you don't reproduce something, that's not a paper. And I think it should be. If you have your null hypothesis not bear out, that should be a paper. And maybe it's not a career-making paper, but why shouldn't that be published? And I'm not afraid of putting much of the peer review after publication rather than before. Sorry, Bernie, you wanted to...
We think that, but funders might not.
Funders might not, and I agree that the funding models, especially if they are government dependent, and you have a government wanting to show they're tough on those lazy dons, that is using, in my era, it was called the RAE, and I learned the adjective, is that RAE-able? And I was like, I don't know, is it? And the RAE has given way to something else, but that is an example of why actually seeing universities being self-funding or through genuine philanthropy, where people grateful for what they're doing just are like, here's a check, good luck, rather than kind of, we really want some papers about fossil fuels. That's why it's so important to manage. Other questions? Yes, right here.
I'm one of these OII students that you've been addressing, and thank you very much for coming here to do that.
Yes.
In your thoughts about the internet, you've spoken about the Internet of Things as a time that opens up maybe a possibility for kind of a renewed conversation as it opens up these maybe dangers and good opportunities.
Yes.
I'm interested maybe to hear your thoughts on what I've kind of started to think about as maybe a similar type of phenomenon in education with the proliferation of online learning institutions. So your Coursera's and your edX's, which are associated with higher education institutions, but also your Udacities or Udemy's, which are more
Yes.
Company or corporate or like individually like amateur based.
Yes.
Just what your thoughts are on this space.
Well, most directly, I've never been that confident that the MOOC model is the way to go, the massive open online course. I think the way in which you have to arrange for evaluation and grading and such tends to just make it an assembly line. There may be some skills for which that is absolutely excellent. I would be hard pressed to say like, you shouldn't learn this skill because you'll only learn it in this way I don't approve of. Like in that sense, of course, there should be a democratization of the way to learn about something. You shouldn't have to come to a residential experience if it can be done to learn it. On the other hand, some of the most important things that happen at a place like this aren't a skill set that you're leveling up like playing a video game and you've just like beaten another boss, like sociology down, but rather you're learning about a discourse and when you can incorporate by reference something you'll never have time to master and when you should be pushing back on it. I mean, when received wisdom isn't wisdom is the exercise where it's working without rails. And I think, I would not say, I wouldn't be enough of an essentialist to say there's no possible way you could teach that in a MOOC. I mean, Diamond Age could happen. But I think the way it will realistically happen in the next crank of things would be through a hub and spoke model. Let there be perhaps some great lecture, some demonstration that through A/B testing and others shows to be a really effective way to teach somebody calculus or get them to think about Chaucer. But then likely it's going to be a local convenor, local to that person, whether digital or otherwise, who's going to engage with that person in a small group of other people and as diverse a group as possible, perhaps, which again might not mean the same geography, to talk about that stuff. Like that to me is what the core learning at the higher education level is going to be about. And the MOOC kind of obscures that. And if we let ourselves listen to the Canadian science minister and think about it as just it's only about jobs and production, that will be to everybody's detriment. And the idea of being able to let everybody be a little bit of a scholar rather than only some become hyper scholars and removed from everybody else, that kind of democratization would really, really pay off. Other questions, wherever the mic can end up?
Thank you for the talk, Scott Hill, Research Fellow here. And I guess you touched on this issue briefly that, historically the internet started as a government funded entity, moved to academia, was a big player early on. It's gone much more to the corporate side now, such that we have A lot of data is within private companies,
Yes.
and therefore the research is moving to the
Yes.
private companies who have the data.
Yes.
How do we change the sort of incentive structures
Yes.
to allow better collaboration between corporate entities and academia, if academia is going to
Yes.
maintain its place?
I think of a bottom-up and a top-down approach. The bottom-up approach is by thinking of certain operations within the company through the lens of the learned profession, and the idea then that the people within the company who are the magicians are going to have as a professional responsibility sharing what they learn, just like lawyers within a company, counsel, attorneys have certain duties that might involve something other than just what the company would prefer. The top-down approach would be to really think about what competition law means from a proactive and prophylactic point of view, which is to say a market-sensitive view. This is not anti-market regulation, it is pro-market regulation, so that Facebook, for example, to solve that problem of Facebook just gets to decide what you see, instead of just having to be transparent and occasionally calling them out for showing us the wrong thing or Google out for the wrong search result, let anybody be able to write a search algorithm that can crawl the data of the Facebook graph or one's own Facebook graph. And then maybe I'll go with your algorithm over, Facebook's would only be the default then. And half of the people in this room might write another. That's a way of lessening the stakes on the oracular piece that comes from them, a given company having, let's call it a monopoly over the relevant data. And I think that form of level playing field is actually pro-innovation, pro-entrepreneurship, pro-Silicon Valley. And if there are ways to acculturate that as a legal norm, that might be a way through top-down. I see from Helen's change in position that was the last question. So I will turn it back over to you, Helen, and thank you all again for this opportunity.
Well, thank you very much, Jonathan. You've entertained us, you've worried us, you've inspired us, and you've made us think. And what more could we want? And now probably we all, particularly you, deserve a drink, which is outside. So thanks very much.
Thank you.